Now, having established the fact that culture affects the way we think and the way we act, it follows then that people from different cultures think differently and act differently. Your book gives 5 dimensions that describe cultural differences. They are power distance, uncertainty avoidance, masculinity and femininity, long-term and short-term orientation, and individualism and collectivism. We're going to talk about each and every one of those. First of all, power distance addresses the question, how should power and wealth be distributed? And some cultures answer that question differently than others. And how you answer that question will affect the way that you communicate. It will affect the way that you conduct business. It'll affect the way that you do things. The uncertainty avoidance dimension focuses on the question, how much risk and uncertainty is tolerable? And cultures that are high in uncertainty avoidance dislike risk and change. They are essentially traditional cultures. They follow strict codes and rules of conduct. But those in low uncertainty avoidance embrace change and are willing to take risks. Then there's the masculinity and femininity dimension, which centers on one question: are men and women essentially different from one another? In some cultures, they're treated as equals. In some cultures, women are treated as inferior. And all of that is a part of the cultural communication dynamic that we have to be aware of, and the differences between culture that make it difficult for us to communicate. Also, there's the idea of long-term and short-term orientation. It has to do with one's orientation to time. It answers the question, is the present, past, or the future more important? And those who take a long-term orientation keep their eye on the future, and they value things like perseverance, and the Asian cultures like that. They have a long view of life. But in cultures with short-term orientation, a respect for the past and present are blended together. They tend to seek instant gratification. They tend to consume things, and they tend to be aware of social status and traditional social statuses and traditional values, and they try to keep things the way that they always have been. Then there's the dimension of individualism and collectivism. And the focus of that dimension is the question, what is the basic unit of society? The individual or the group? And countries that have an individualist view believe that the most important social unit is the person acting in his or her own interest. And Americans are individualists, and we tend to make our own decisions, develop our own opinions, solve our own problems, have our own things. And in general, we learn to view the world from the viewpoint of self. But the opposite of individualism is collectivism. And in collectivist cultures, people believe it's right to subordinate personal goals for the good of others. And for collectivists, shared identity is more important than personal identity. People in collectivist cultures are generally comfortable in vertical relationships where some people have more status or higher status than others. But people who are individualist are most comfortable in horizontal relationships where everybody is on an equal playing field, where we all have equal status. One of the attitudes that most interferes with successful intercultural communication is the belief that everything that can be said in one language can be said in another, that meanings are directly translatable. And that simply is not the case. There are concepts that sometimes are central to the language of a culture that cannot be translated easily into the language of another culture. The Asians have a concept of face. It has to do with self-identity. It has to do with humility. It has to do with a certain way of conducting life. And it's very hard to translate into English what self or what face is, what it means. But it is a cultural construct, and it creates a barrier for communication. There are other aspects that affect the way we communicate in a culture, the way our language is, and you need to look in the book and be aware of context dependence. Know what a low context culture is, what a high context culture is. You need to be aware of directness and how that affects communication. You need to be aware of expressiveness and how that affects communication. And finally, you need to be aware of formality and how that affects communication. Now, sometimes our culture impresses upon us certain attitudes that can affect our ability to successfully communicate with other cultures. Stereotypes, those ideas, secondhand beliefs that become the conceptual bias by which we make sense out of what goes on around us. And we tend to define whole people groups on the basis of stereotypes. And it's a preconception that isn't necessarily accurate. As a matter of fact, most of the time is way overgeneralized. And it doesn't necessarily fit the circumstances or the context that we're in. But our communication is governed by those stereotypes. And although stereotypes help us reduce uncertainty and they make the world seem more predictable, they interfere with objective perception. Once we've decided how a particular culture group will act or behave, we stop thinking about them objectively and we start thinking about them as a generalized whole. And that can be detrimental. It can undermine our ability to communicate between cultures. Another thing that is impressed upon you by culture that can undermine your ability to communicate between cultures is prejudice. And a prejudice is a special kind of stereotype. It is a negative social attitude held by members of one group towards members of another group. It's an attitude that biases perception and provides a rationale for discrimination. And prejudices are products of in-group interaction. Very rarely are they the result of direct contact with out-group members. You have an in-group, and an in-group judges the out-group. And they don't judge the out-group on the basis of the interaction with the out-group. They judge the out-group on the basis of a collective shared belief structure in the in-group. And the purpose of prejudice is to draw a line between in-group and out-group members. It's a line that divides those who are superior from those who are inferior. Table 12.3 details some of the cognitive biases that people use to keep their prejudices intact. Biases that allow them to see differences where no difference exists, or to distort differences that do exist. And you'll do well to look over that. There's a negative bias, an interpretation bias, a discounting bias, a fundamental bias, an attribution bias, an exaggeration bias, a polarization bias. There will be questions on those biases on the test over this chapter. There's another kind of stumbling block that can be almost as major as stereotypes and prejudices, and it's on the opposite end of the spectrum. Whenever we have an assumption of similarity, whenever we refuse to see that there truly are differences between our culture and another culture, we try just to communicate as if there is no difference, assuming that everyone is the same, everyone thinks the same, everyone understands me, everyone gets what I'm saying. That may reduce our feelings of discomfort in another culture, but it also results in insensitivity to the real differences that exist between our culture and another culture. So not only do we need to not prejudge a culture and not establish biases and prejudices, but we also need to recognize that there are differences, and those differences are not necessarily bad. Sometimes they're healthy and they're good. And if we're going to communicate with another culture effectively, then we have to be able to communicate around those differences and without prejudice and bias.